Bryan,
Hi, Achim. How are you?
see you, my friend. Yeah, I'm good.
Mm.
And I brought something for you. You see it here on the screen.
Yes.
That's from our friend we just talked about at Ebbinghaus.
Mm.
And what is this?
The forgetting curve, right?
Exactly, that's right. And we put this up here as a small introduction or nugget, what we are going to talk about today. It's spaced repetition.
Mm, mm,
Such a wonderful topic, highly underutilized, I would
mm.
say. I think a lot of people that have part of their job or their career or whatever to memorize certain things or to get prolific in certain things,
Mm.
obviously vocabulary and so on. There, even my 13-year-old daughter recently was introduced to this concept by her school, which thought was amazing.
To spaced repetition
Spaced
or to the
repetition,
Ebbinghaus.
exactly.
Okay.
And yeah, but you can use it for anything. I just listened to the Lex Friedman podcast, and the KGB spy talked about it for how to
Mm,
get
mm.
like learn another language also, but also learn terms, technical terms, and so on. It reminds me also of a story that on Anki, this tool where you can share libraries of spaced repetition content, people
Yes.
found access codes to I would say missile silos. I
Oh,
don't know if they
wow.
were nuclear or something, which the people in the army who have to know these codes
We're
use the
recording
tool at
them.
the beginning to remember them, to get them in their heads, to not fail the
Mm.
exams or whatever. Like
So do you want to talk us through this graph of,
yes.
yeah.
So what you see here is that's the forgetting curve, and you see here time, right, and strength of memory on the other hand. And what you can see here that we have a decay, right? Like we all know it, we forget things over time. But what Ebbinghaus found out in experiments is that if you bring it, resurface it again, for example, with a prompt, or you think of something, or somebody mentions something in a conversation, then the memory get revised and you start again. Basically, you
Mm,
have it
mm.
now. You start from the beginning. You have a strong memory of it. Now you see here, you could think basically, okay, now I have to remind myself every month of something. Far from it. It's actually not necessary to have it in the same cadence every time, because
Mm,
when you
mm.
get you reminded of something, the memory gets stronger,
Right.
right? In the brain, the connection gets stronger. And that means, for example, I can use here in this article, which I will also highlight a little bit
Ooh,
later. If
yeah.
I spread it a little bit out here to the optimal time, and then revive the memory, you see here that it already took more time. I could, edit a little bit more time, and now the next one I could even, spread even more into the future. It's
Mm,
now supported here in this graph, but I can spread it even more into the future. I don't have to remind myself that maybe first we start with 1 month, then it's 2 months, and then maybe it's 6 months, and then maybe it's 1 year, and then maybe it's like present for the rest of my life, more or less.
mm, mm, mm.
So yeah, powerful concept, right?
Yes. And so it allows you to slide, okay, auto optimize. And so the idea is that if it decays faster, okay, I
Yes.
see.
If it decays faster, you see that the shape now slows down. It's now auto-optimized, right? But
Yes.
that means you see here the perfect shape. I can even put the sweet spot a little bit further down. Then you see it here. You see that here, if you remember it here, it gets revived. Then a little bit later here, and then it already
Yeah.
starts to compound, or not compound, that's not the right word, but to get longer and longer interval that are necessary, because this curve, the shape of the curve gets slower and slower the stronger the connection in your brain.
Right.
And
So,
we all know it, right? A concept that we learned in school, we repeat it a couple of times, maybe a song or something, we have it, right? Like it's
mm.
available. But again, something you recently learned, you're still in this early part of the
And you
process.
forget it quickly, right?
Yes, you forget it much quicker. And if
Right.
you want to combat that, if you don't want that to happen, the forgetting curve and space repetition is your friend.
Right. And so just to kind of summarize, if you're trying to learn a piece of information, at first you might need to review it, within a couple days, and then once you've done that review, maybe within a few more days, and then eventually on the time frame of weeks, and then maybe months. And if you kind of follow this optimum schedule, then the idea is that you'll review it the fewest number of times to remember it more or less forever. Is that
Yes.
the idea?
Totally.
Mm.
And this article, I can not recommend it high enough. For me, that's like whenever I think of spaced repetition, I think of this picture, which is a little bit odd, but I think of that article. It's
Yes.
NK's me. I mean, if you type in how to remember anything forever, then you find that article.
Yes.
And it's interactive. It was translated in a lot of languages, and it's really fun to go through it. You have these little animations, remind me a little bit like it's a mixture between wait, but why, and
Yes.
maybe the melting asphalt or these interactive articles, or like you have, it's just a great article, and you can play with it. You can, have interactive elements, and you really learn the concept
Yes.
when reading that article.
Yeah, and you mentioned Anki, which is a piece of open source software, ANKI, that's often used to design, often they're called decks. It's a bit like flashcards, right? And so if in school, if you're old enough, you had these index cards, and on one side you might write like a vocabulary word, and then on the other side a definition.
Yeah.
And you would like look at them, see the word, what's the definition, flip it over. And I think that's where they get this deck sort of metaphor. And I guess Anki cards, that's the way they're structured, aren't they? There's a kind of single line title, and then there's whatever you want on the other side, right?
Yes. I mean, it started, I think this concept was used with flashcards, right? Like with little, for studying something. And so you often have these references, for example, that you can turn something around, right? Even if it's digital, or you can reveal something, and you have a little title, and then you have, but more or less in Anki, they can even be fully multimedia, I think. Like it evolved a little bit over time. There's also Quizlet. I think that Quizlet is another app that's very successful, and that's all in that space. But I think even more important about the individual app is to know about this concept and to think about how to implement it into the things that you need, right? Like into your workflow. It's a tool. It's a little bit like writing something down, right?
Yes.
You do it because you don't want to forget something.
Yes.
But if you really don't want to forget something, if you want to have it in your head, be it a name, be it a concept, then writing down is not enough, right? Like you need to be aware
on some kind of schedule. Otherwise it's going to disappear, right?
Yes. And it's not even, I would not even say it must be technical that you have to be on a schedule and you have to use a tool and so on. It can also be like schedule something to talk about it again. Oops, my camera, one moment. Whoop. We have a heat wave here in Berlin at the moment, and my camera feels the heat, it seems like.
Oh, wow.
So you can build an organic system if you want, if you are just aware, right? Imagine one good bridge could be you read a book, right?
Yes.
And then you are amazed by this book, and you think like, oh, I have to put this to practice. I have to build this into my life, or I should not forget about that. Then what you should be aware of, that you're going to forget, right? Like it's going to happen. So if you want to have the content of this book as a tool, find a way to revive the memory.
Yes.
Maybe, a month later, put it somewhere where you find it again a month later, and just skip through it. We only need the nudge, right? We don't need to reread it from cover to cover, but we need to revive our memory of the good stuff. Right? Maybe you have.
So one way would be to sort of take notes as you're going, and then go back to these notes later on.
Exactly.
I mean, and we've talked a little bit about that problem, which is that we kind of take notes and then often don't remember that later step of going back to them, which I'm certainly guilty of. And it does relate to sort of one of the other technologies that I've spoken about before, which is Readwise, which allows you to take digital highlights from Kindle, for example, and also allows you to take highlights from Hypothesis, which allows you to just mark up any website. Yeah. And then if you use the daily review, it puts these on some kind of schedule. So it's another kind of seamless way. Whereas with Anki, it's a bit
Interesting.
more manual, right? So either
Yeah.
you can use someone else's deck, which I know that there's another article I think by Michael Nielsen and Andy Matushak about some of their ways of thinking about learning. And I
This
will
one
tweet
maybe?
some of these
Why
as we go.
books?
Yeah, I think they have one. Is it?
This is why books don't work.
Yeah,
Oh,
I
this,
think it might be this one. Yeah. And
I have
so,
here in my library, I found Why Books Don't Work and
yes,
Quantum
and
Countries
Quantum Country, which
application.
is another application that they used
Yeah.
using this spaced repetition.
Yes.
I would like to also hear about your experience. Like, do you have any practice of kind of bringing things back in that way?
So that's a good point. I don't have a systematic practice yet. It's one of these things that I neglect, and it would be so valuable to put it in my routine, but I don't have
Mm,
it yet. But I find myself um, kind of going for it from time to time. For example, when I read something and I see the book mentioned that I now feel, oh, I forgot already what it's all about, I go back into my notes, right, and look at it again. Recently, what I did was to combine this even with YouTube videos of book summaries, for example. A YouTube books video of a book summary is maybe 8 minutes, 10 minutes sometimes.
mm,
If
mm,
I
mm.
if you listen to it on 1.5 speed, right, or watch it, then it's even faster. And it's enough to really, revive your memory of this of the content,
Mm,
and
mm.
it adds another layer to it, right, because you have an even new experience. So even if you don't highlight, even if you don't summarize, then something like that could work. And that's
Yes.
how I do it. Just recently, I had tremendous success with it, uncovering also like new relationships between things I read in the past, because it was just, uh, yeah, a time-spaced approach
Yeah,
to
that's a
revive
great
your
tip.
memory.
I've actually never really used YouTube for that purpose. I've occasionally used podcasts where I've gone, okay, what was in that book? And then I would search
Yeah,
for the podcast within, usually Google Podcasts is the best way to do this because most podcast apps allow you to search only within sort of, once you already know the podcast, then you can search for episodes. Whereas Google Podcasts allows you to search across episodes. So you can just search
mm,
for an author within within that, and it can be very useful to find. It's also what I do when I first encounter a thinker that I know, oh,
yeah,
I should know some person about something about this, but I don't even know which podcast would have covered their
yes,
work. And so I'll go search for Baudrillard or whatever just across every podcast and just
yeah,
see where it comes up. I have this Readwise implementation of spaced repetition, and I have used Anki in the past. It's a little bit tricky to design cards well, I think. And so I think that very article that you've got open there, I'll tweet these as we go
yeah,
along. That Andy Matushak wrote is discouraging people from either using other people's decks, which is that they're not really tuned to what you're doing, and also to using decks for no like clear purpose. So like, if a very common one you get is like countries' capitals or something, and you get all the ones in the world and people start going through those, or flags or something like that. And there may be good reasons to memorize those so that but if you don't have like a kind of driving motive
yeah,
behind it, then it's not maybe like the best use of time. And I've also found this in my own experience, which is that there are certain things that just become kind of disconnected pieces of knowledge
yeah,
if I review them on this schedule. One of them is, or it's almost like they do stay in memory, but in a kind of odd way. So, for example, John McPhee writes about these different geological periods, and he has like an acronym which is like it's CODSMPP or something like that, CODSMPPP or something like that. And so I'll see if I can do it. Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Mississippian, Pennsylvanian, Permian, or something like
wow,
that, so that you
yeah,
know the order. And so I've got that actually.
yeah,
Now I've got that piece of knowledge, and some of the extinction events, there's this idea that there are 5 major extinction events, and these line up on some of these boundaries, basically.
Mhm.
So there's an Ordovician Silurian boundary extinction event.
Yeah.
And I've put that into Readwise in like this spaced repetition way. And I remember, like, I can remember it, but I have to go back to this acronym and then like think about all the dates, and like it's work to remember it. Do you
Yeah.
know what I mean? Like,
Yes.
and so it's kind of interesting because that one I have been reviewing for a while, and it is in there because I can retrieve it with a bit of effort, but it's not like I can just like I can spout off the list of names, but if you say, okay, when does the Ordovician Silurian extinction event happen? I have to think, well, okay, Cambrian explosion's like
Yeah.
590 million years ago, and then I'm pretty sure there's one extinction that's like 475 to 460 million years ago, and then one that's like more like 400. And so then I would be like trying to map this onto the acronym that I've memorized. Have you
But
noticed things like that where you
yes.
like memorize it and then you end up with this weird memory that like
Well, that makes total sense. And I think this is like some people say, give the example of the alphabet. And then if I
right.
say like, name the fifth from the end, the
Yes.
fifth letter, then like I'm like, okay, so it's
You have to like count backwards.
you have to go there, and that's how the brain works. I totally subscribe to that the brain is basically a path, right? Like it's a map, and you go from these points to points, and there are certain routes available. It's
Right.
a limited amount of routes to retrieve a memory.
Mm,
We
mm.
always know we can actually revive a memory if we get the result, right? Like there
Right.
seems to be something, I think it's this strong pattern recognition. If you
Right.
see a photo, a picture of a place, you know immediately whether you were there or not, like or high confidence. That's a powerful move. But if you are asked to retrieve it on your own, you have to go a
You have
path.
to go through
And
this
that
path that you
and
laid
that path
down.
is
Yeah.
really limited, right? You
Yeah.
have to think, oh, well, let me see. It's in Scotland, so I was on that vacation in Scotland. We started
Yeah.
there. It's like a memory palace, right?
Yes.
Where
Yes.
that's another concept worth basically putting into the mix here. But
Yes.
so yeah, very like that, and it's a good example of how spaced repetition is one tool in the arsenal.
Right.
It can help you. I mean, for example, just one example where I could use it immediately is I was talking about temperature a lot, and with friends from the States, it's always Fahrenheit, and here it's Celsius, and the calculation is too complex for me to do it in my head. But
5 ninths and something about 32.
Exactly. Yeah. But the thing is, it's very easy if I would just have some proper milestones, for example, like some proper points for example, everything above 30 degrees Celsius is really hot. Like
Really
people are
hot.
like, oh, they're sweating. And I've now learned that everything in the 90s is really hot, right? Like that's just a milestone, 30 to 90, let's say. And then 21 degrees for me is like, there it starts to get comfortable, right? It's the indoor temperature in most places. And so if it's outside 21 degrees, I know like, I don't have to worry. It's basically like being at home.
Yes.
So I learned that this is more like in the 70s, right? Like in the 70s, it's like one of these temperature. Now I could continue having a few more milestones, and that makes it easy. If somebody says, oh, it's like 79 degrees or whatever, then I can just do a little bit of the math and say like, oh, that's there. And if they say like 95, I would say like, whoa.
Yes.
and so
This is interesting because as an American who's moved to Europe, I had to make decisions about am I going to switch over thinking about my weight from pounds to kilograms? Am I going to think about miles or kilometers? And of course, England's also a bit weird because they're also kind of haven't quite made their mind up somehow. And then the other one is like, I'm a type 1 diabetic, and blood sugar is on a different scale as well. Yeah. And so at some point I did make the conscious decision, okay, like I'd already changed from saying Fahrenheit to Celsius just because you can't just talk about Fahrenheit here anymore. But then with the blood sugar, it took a few years, but then it was like doctor's visits where it was like this whole annoying thing where each time I would say it, they're like, okay, well, what's that? And I was like, I'm just going to have to switch all my meters and everything over to the new system. And then you get through experience, right? And through I mean, at first you have to do all these calculations, but then, like you say, you get the milestone. Like around 100 is good in the American system, which is milligrams per deciliter, and around 7 is good for the kind of European system. So they're quite different scales,
Yeah.
for millimoles per liter, I think it is. And so it's an interesting one, right? Because you have to think. In that case, like you say, there's I could just know high, medium, and low, and that might be much better than knowing the fact that you multiply 1 by 18, which is like, you can also multiply by 18, but like it might be quicker just to know rough guides, right?
And again, thinking from the tool perspective on where you could use spaced repetition. I mean, it feels to me like really an entry level. Like if you want to know something, if you want to have it available somehow, right, then you should be aware of that. I mean, just imagine if you want to have available, I can never answer this question. What books have I read last year?
Yes.
I don't know. I have no clue. It's like they fade away. What?
Oh no, that's a fascinating one. I keep track on Goodreads, actually.
Right? Yeah. And obviously, I also have some methods of finding that again. But again, if I want to have this, for example, if I want to talk about this in a conversation, I should have it in mind. So I could have this list on a spaced repetition card.
That's quite useful, because I have. Like, I don't even know what I did last week. Like, what was the book I read before this one? I don't know. You know what I mean? Like,
or another one. I mean, it's really for working memory, because you are a good example. When we have one of our inspiring calls, I often hear you talking like, and there was this article, and then I had click on the keyboard, and then it's this article from this person, and it's written there, and I can send you the link because you have a tool. You have your own tool to retrieve it quickly in a conversation. So you could, for example, you don't have to have everything available that you have in your tool in these typical remote situations, but you might select a few of those things that you really want to keep in working memory, to have it with you all the time. And it might be interesting to even think about what that is, right? What is more valuable in your brain to have it immediately available compared to what you can look up, right? If you have a trusted system to look it up, maybe even at the end of the day, right? Maybe on mobile or whatever, then that might be good enough for a lot of things.
And there's one that has changed. I think we may have talked about it before, which is dates for me. And it came really from film, actually, because I've watched a lot of film, been very into film for a long time. And I noticed that I was starting to remember what years films came out in. And it was often because I would try to guess, like just as a kind of game with myself, before I looked them up. And it turns out this is a really good way to memorize things. And it's a general principle, which is that, if you don't know someone's name, you should try to guess it before asking them, because even if you get it wrong, the memory will stick better, actually. And so
perfect. Just the explanation I read the other day, that failing puts you in a mode of like learning new information quickly, which is totally natural, right? You do something, it goes wrong. Now you need to learn how to do it right. So guessing a name, even if it's wrong, is a benefit.
Exactly. And so that's why, like, I was realizing that if you guess dates of a film, then you see the film, and on IMDb or Wikipedia or whatever, there's always the date. Then I was playing this little game where I was like, oh, and then I realized that I could actually name off like a list of the director's films by date, which seems like it would require this weird amount of work, but actually it doesn't. And so I started doing this with also the dates of major events and the lifespans of different authors, for example. And one sort of emergent quality that comes out of that is that what's going on roughly in multiple places in the world at once, just because you can say a date and you kind of know that it's in the date range of this author's lifetime, let's say. You know what I mean? And I'm not saying, like, I'm not doing anything special except that like 1 second of, when I try to think of Nietzsche, let's say, I think 1844, 1900, maybe it's wrong.
Yeah.
But if it's right, then it's like, but then if it's wrong, like you say, I think it's because pain puts your brain into learning mode.
Yeah.
So
Right, failing, failing is. I think that's you maybe it's pain, but it's also this like when you do something right, you get a dopamine hit or something, and it strengthens.
yes,
Right,
it's
and then
positive reinforcement and then negative, but you
yeah,
only get
and
it
it's
if you
only
try
natural,
that.
or I cannot prove it, but from what I've heard, right, it's only natural that you have the opposite as well, because
Yes,
it would make things much more efficient. Two
yes,
organisms, one is specifically tuned of learning when they do something wrong, the other one just learns the same way every day. Then of course this is more fit, right, like
yes.
for adapting.
I like it because it's like, well, one, it's a really easy trick, right? Which is just like if there's information that you want to know, retain, you got to guess it before you look it up,
Yes.
even if looking it up is really easy. And then the interesting thing that is coming from what you're saying is that it's not just the stick, it's carrot and stick, right? Which is that it's punishment and reward, in the sense that if you get it wrong, you get a punishment. And if you get it right, you get this kind of reward where you're like, oh, I got it right. You know what I mean? And so it does reinforce it. And I don't know, it just seems like a general principle that I wish I had been using for longer in more domains, let's say, because many of the places that I used it was not actually something that I really, what year a film came out is not always that relevant. Although at the same time, knowing what's in a film gives you a vibe of the overall world. So if you think, okay, well, what's going on in 1957, and then you think, oh, I know this film that came out in that year.
Well, it talks to culture, right? It shows you something of the culture, but it also, and probably even more important, revives your own memories of an area, right? Like of an imagine. I mean, especially in your lived experiences, right?
Yes.
If you mention Terminator 2,
Yeah.
I was in my teens, right? And this was
1991
blockbuster. Like this was amazing. Like I had a big picture in my room. Now,
is it 1991? That's my guess.
Really?
That's my guess. I don't know.
1991 would fit perfectly because I was 12 then, and
1991. I got it.
Whoa. Very good. So you see my little 12-year-old, like having this big picture, which I got from a blockbuster, basically, right? Like it was huge, and from a cinema it could have been. So and this immediately triggers a lot of memories, right? Like this gives me context of my life back in the day. So
yes.
I couldn't tell you this now if you just asked me about my 20s, right? Like it's again, I have not a strong memory, probably because that I don't have these routines of talking about it often with other people, or maybe having this guessing game that you do. And this is this can be a powerful tool as well. And it's totally related to spaced repetition, right? Because it's a little of this spike that we talked about in the beginning of the call, that once you guess it, once you get it right or wrong, whatever, you're back here. You're back you're looking it up, and you will probably remember it for a longer period of time.
Right, because what we've done is just like a point on the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, right? It's reinforced 1991 is when Terminator 2 came out, right?
And the caveat is it would be beneficial if it would be in the sweet zone of forgetting it. The idea here of the zone, we didn't talk about this, the yellow zone that I showed, there was you nearly forgot it, but it's not yet fully forgotten, right? Like that's the sweet spot. You don't create a new memory, but you rather basically strengthen the old one. So,
I was also thinking about, like children love repetition. And, I remember when I was a kid watching the same movie again and again and again.
Exactly.
I wonder if this follows some kind of like forgetting curve where you're like, you were really, I don't know, like if kids.
Learning mode, full on learning mode, right? Like I see the same thing. I was witnessing it now with my daughter. This, like, she could never get enough of certain things. And especially if they triggered a strong response. For example, I don't know, in the beginning it was somebody tripping and falling. And she was like, whoa, again. Right, like again, and then like, oh,
fall again.
And I think it was not look at this tree,
Yes.
again and
Yeah.
again and again. It was really like the things that stood out to her.
So
And
unexpected things, or
unexpected things she had to she deemed important.
right.
And this ties maybe back to a tangent that stuck with me. It was somebody on a Tim Ferriss interview way back, and he said, if you look at children from a neuro perspective, they love to do what's really important for them right now. So we all know maybe the peekaboo game, like where you say like, "Whoo, I'm going whoo," and then they love it. They want to see more, and that's exactly when they figure out depth, right, and field of view, like what's in front,
Object
what's
permanence,
behind,
stuff like that. Yeah.
If you picture now a computer, and this is so fascinating, and that in our lifetime we witness now machine learning. If they look at a picture like this, like our video here now, right?
Yes.
And you see the hand here, and you see the hand here, and then an algorithm at the beginning really doesn't know what's going on, right? Like they don't know if it's back, if it's suddenly gone, if it's like they don't have a clue. But if you do this enough times, and you put it into learning mode, basically, at some point they know the neural network knows whether something is behind you or in front of you, or if it's gone, if you don't have a hand, right? Something like that. They can figure that out too. And children do exactly that. They do just learning, right? They are in reinforcement learning mode, and they crave it because they tell you so, or they just do it. They just love it. Or throwing things out from like gravity, right? Like they throw things from the table, and parents are freaking out, but that's exactly what they need. They need to figure out like, oh, if I push it over the edge, then it falls. How come? Like, and then again and again, and they don't understand, but they can work with it, right? They will at some point know what happens when they push something over the edge.
And so this brings up a lot of fascinating questions, like, what about animation, or what about, CG or computer generated or AI generated things like that children watch? I'm sure that people have been worried about this for a long time, but like, does that interfere with learning, or does it, do they kind of get that it's a flat, that it's a screen and screens don't operate that the way the rest of the world does? I just don't know. It's an open question.
But I mean, my opinion, we are leaving a little bit the space repetition territory, but just quickly, is that nature in general and humans and like are learning machines, right? And they adapt to anything. Like at least they make the effort, right? And and so our children will get fluent in things that we cannot really grasp, because we, for example, grew up in a physical world, but they grow up in a digital world. So they have a different neural net, right? They can do certain things on a screen. Probably they visualize it much different and much better than us. My mother, she was always, for example, my parents, they couldn't figure out that the user interface changes, because when they grew up, they had a button, and this button stayed. Right? Like, it wasn't that button. You could always find it in the physical realm. And if I would say, here's a screen, and you just this and this and this, they were like, where's the button? Where am I? Right? Like they didn't have a clue, because they had to actually learn it again, which is possible, but requires failing, requires doing this hard work. And our children, children
are wired to, or unwired in such a way that they can learn anything at that early.
And they have now a user interface, like, part in their brain, probably a really good neural network.
Like if they are in this really intense learning mode, why do they like repetition so much? I am curious about that, because you would think that if they're really, really good at learning, then they would be like, right, third time, got it. Don't need to review that for years, because they've got this.
Think about a computer again. Like, you have to feed it a lot of data, a lot of variance, so that they can figure out the edges, basically. My guess is that, and I think again, machine learning is such a good analogy. It's not 100% the same, but it's really close. For example, I would say a child predicts, and if the prediction is wrong, they say like, oh, again, right? Okay. If it's below a certain threshold, they say, I haven't figured it out yet, not consciously, but they say like, I want more data, more data. And then their prediction gets better and better and better. And then something sometimes it's boring because they know what happens.
Right.
And
Yeah.
then they say like, okay, next, something else, right? Like I want to
And they want a new toy.
a new toy because
Yeah.
they want to figure it out. And at some point,
Yeah.
you don't play with toys because you figured them out. You know how it works.
Mm.
Now that ties back into the, I don't know if we talked about my flow obsession at the moment, but I think as adults, we
Yeah.
often stop, we get bored with
Right.
certain things. And what we could do is up the challenge. If
Difficulty.
we would
Right.
up the challenge, it would
Yes.
still fascinate us. Some
Mm.
people do, right? For example, some people still play with Lego. They create their own, as grown-ups, they create their own models. They continue to do that. And we
Yes.
look at it maybe from the outside and say like, well, I would never do that. And I think that's totally wrong. We would do it if we would be at the same skill level as
Yes.
they are.
Right.
And this would be a nice challenge for us. Right? We would say, we have now built 200 models. And this new model they bring out, I wonder if I could do it like faster, if I could build it faster or whatever. And I wonder if they use the same technique as last time. So they are in the zone when they play with Lego.
Yes.
And you are not in the zone because you would have to start from scratch or earlier or whatever in your custom sweet spot.
So do you think this is a general principle? Because we're talking about like flashcard one side and the challenge is what's on the other side. And keeping that attuned to your knowledge is do you think that's akin to the kind of challenge that you undertake when you do a certain exercise or you build a Lego thing, that you're basically just trying to set this difficulty so that it's like not so easy that it gets boring and not so difficult that you can't do it? And so is it a kind of general principle? I don't know.
I guess my new like working hypothesis is that everything can be very rewarding if you go into this flow mode. When it comes to spaced repetition, we have a problem because the challenge is fairly steep in the beginning because you have to buy something like flashcards or install something like that. You have to write something down that is somehow meaningful to you, right? Somehow you should be convinced that you want to learn that. And then you have to build up the habit of revisiting it. There's some problem, right? Like, or friction. If you would set it up, I think we would all find it rewarding in the same way, right? We would, if that would be facilitated, if you would have your personal spaced repetition coach, we would come to your door and say like, hey, now like, just tell me what you need. Like, do you need to be a little bit more well-versed in finance or maybe in a certain sport that you have to talk with your friends about or whatever? I do the cards. I give you the schedule. I call you when you have to do the repetition thing, and I coach you if you have a problem. We would all love it. We would crave it because it would be in the same, in the sweet spot, and we would get the reward. And it would be constantly challenging, constantly learn. We would constantly learn. So it would, I think, be very rewarding. But again, the friction is why we don't all do it.
Yeah, and I think I could talk a little bit about. So I've used spaced repetition. I've used Anki for extremely different purposes. Let's just say one is I've used it for poetry, which is basically I want to read all of Shakespeare's sonnets. Let's say I actually did this, but I know that if I read them, just like poetry is not best read, just once front to back. And so with some poetry collections, I've just kind of over a course of days just read the same pages until I get bored of that one and then move on to the later poems. And I think that works quite well. That's probably the way that poetry books are intended to be consumed. But I have also done it with spaced repetition with Anki, actually. I've just put, if someone recommends me a poem, I just put it into Anki. And then when I'm at the gym, I'm reading these poems in between sets, basically. Yeah. And I did find that I was retaining, it's interesting because I wasn't trying to memorize them. So I would, like within Anki, one of the things we haven't really touched upon in this discussion of spaced repetition is that you can say how well you remembered it, right? At least within some of these pieces of software, which is in Anki, there's like an easy, moderate, hard, or you didn't get it, right? And so I'm kind of having to map this on in terms of I guess I'm mapping it to like boredom levels, which is like, okay, I saw this poem recently enough that I don't really want to read it again. So I mark it as easy because I know it'll come back
Yeah.
much later. Right. And that I think is like a good experience. The other way I've used it is to learn commands within Vim, which is basically a text editor. So
That's
like very
awful. Yeah.
technical. Yeah. And then that is even more sort of powerful, I guess, because in other contexts, you're having to call up that information. You're like, okay, I know this is possible. And is it, can I bring it to memory to actually do it?
Yes.
Whereas with the poetry, although I enjoyed it, I think I wasn't just reciting poetry enough randomly.
Yeah.
So maybe if I had a
Yes,
life
right?
where
I mean,
I also rewarded in another context for just reciting poetry from memory, then it would be a great idea. But my life
yes.
is unfortunately not like that. So
I mean, I would now basically
in fact, it's quite the
theorize.
opposite, which is people do not like it when when I recite poetry. I think so.
Yes, that's the opposite effect.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
actually, I think like working with poetry can be intrinsically rewarding, and it's again a matter if you would have drilled into it and asked you the following questions. For example, you realize that you don't like it so much anymore to revisit these poems, then
Yes.
you probably should have asked yourself, or you could have asked yourself, is it too challenging for me or is it too easy? And if it's boring, if it's boring, you should have ramped up the difficulty level somehow,
Yes.
right? And if it's too challenging, the opposite, right? To get back into the zone, to get back into the flow, and then the basically the test would be: do you then love it again? Like, or
Right.
like at least you say like, yeah, I want to do this, and when you do it, time passes quickly, and so on. I would even say that this is part of our human behavior. For example, why do you put this into your workout routine, reciting poetry? And now my theory again in this context would be, yes, you might have like, oh, I can use the time more efficient, but even I think it was a tool you grabbed to ramp up the difficulty of your workout, because otherwise you would not go to your workout anymore, because you would somehow reach a plateau. You would say like, well, I can do the repetitions, it's okay, I feel slightly bored, right? Like something's wrong. But
Yes.
if you add this new component to it, it gets exciting. Somehow again, you reach a threshold where you again come into a favorable zone.
That's
where
a
you think like,
fascinating
okay, it's
idea.
fine, I go. I don't dread it.
I love that. And also, I mean, yeah, it's true, right? Because if you're doing exercises at the gym, that is literally spaced repetition, right? Because
Totally.
you have to take time off and then you come back and you do the same thing, but just a little more difficult. And that's like exactly what we're talking about, isn't it?
Yeah, well, obviously, like somebody with a theory would now say, no, it's completely different. But I think you're totally right. Like it's the same animal, let's say.
And just to throw in another one, meditation is a bit like this, which is like, at first you're kind of just trying to just return your attention to the breath again and again, counting the breath, maybe like trying to break down, okay, what is the exact start and finish of the breath? And so there's all these like, when you get meditate, and that's just with the breath, there's other ways of increasing the challenge that you're doing on the meditation cushion. And it's an interesting idea that, yeah, like, and there are some of the challenges that come up in meditation. One is like dullness, which is that it's essentially like boredom, right? And so maybe you're actually already good at following the breath. And if you just keep doing that, you just kind of get bored. And so you actually need to ramp up the difficulty by saying, okay, but what can I see at the, in the very instant that this breath starts, or something like that, and increasing almost the detail, or maybe I expand awareness so that it's not just this focus point, or maybe it's even more intensely focused. I don't know. It's just I think you're right that it is a general principle of improvement, right?
Yeah, it would really easily explain why so many people struggle with meditation. And I don't think because it's too challenging, even though it's technically challenging, right?
Yeah.
But it's hard to be aware that it's so challenging, right?
Yeah.
A lot of people sit there, think about their day, and they're saying like, yeah, well, and they don't know that they're actually failing to meditate because they were thinking.
You can't tell from the outside.
Yeah, and the task is really to drop the thoughts. And on the other hand, if you do that, it can quickly feel boring. And
Mm.
and I mean, again, I think good meditation teachers, they make this part of the exercise, right? Boredom is something that is like, again, a failure mode. So
Yes.
you have to go back, and if people get it, they can get into the zone to actually love to do meditation, because
Right.
their level of skill
Yes.
increases visibly, and the challenge, and you see it everywhere, that people who get it then increase the difficulty. They go to silent retreats. They join
Mm.
communities. They do it on different schedules. They try to apply it to their life in different ways. So
Yes.
that, I think it's a general principle that
Mm.
we need to stay in the flow area, and it tied very well back to learning, right?
Yes.
And learning was triggered by our spaced repetition
Yes.
conversation, which is basically a tool for to learn. And if you want to have something in working memory, right? If you want to basically have strong connections in your
Mm.
in your
So the overall takeaway is you need a schedule of doing these repetitions. And if it gets too easy, you need to make it harder, not stop doing it, basically.
Exactly. That's a wonderful takeaway that puts a few of these things together. So first of all, spaced repetition is something that can significantly, and I'm talking to myself here too, increase your, like, give you a lot of skills when it comes to navigate the world, because you have more in your working memory that you can put to good use. The challenge at the beginning is to get started and to have this set, and there the goal would be to make it very easy for you, right? So for example, now my advice to myself would be to start with 5 cards. Just buy the cards now from Amazon, basically, or make it as easy as possible. You just buy the note cards. A7 is a good format in Europe, and then you get them, and then you say, okay, I take 5 of those, and I write something down that I want to remember. In my case, it would be now the Fahrenheit, Celsius. That was something that's on my mind, but it could be also something that you find meaningful in a way, and you don't have to think about it so long, right? Because you have to get started. Then look up the system. That's, again, an easy task, how to do it. There is a little bit more complex than we talked about it here, right? You have 5 different, if you do it not with Anki, but with physical cards, which I would recommend in the beginning. It's a little bit, put success in your way is always what I say to myself. So if it's on my home screen or somewhere, no, if it's somewhere buried in my phone, I will never look at it again.
Yes.
So, but note cards, if they
or
are,
build it into a routine, like
Yeah.
like I used to do at the gym. I'm trying to think of why I stopped doing that, and I think my workout routine is harder. So maybe partly, like I was making it harder in a different way once I got to like a physical plateau. And then I think there is this issue that I think I was becoming more annoying, not less annoying, as I learned more poetry, basically.
There's a poem for you.
Yeah.
That's such a good move at a party.
And so I think you mentioned that you had some idea of integrating it into Trickle.app, right?
Yeah, into Trickle. Well, we did it in the past. The good thing in Trickle is that we have everything, sources and so on, like these websites. This article that I showed you is a source, is an item, right? It's basically like a flashcard if you think about it. And then
when you've last seen that, is that like accessible?
And then you could put it on a schedule. And we were experimenting already with some modes, and we would apply the same what you said. So if you want to see it again, like you can say, basically, I want more of this. I want to see it more often.
Yes.
Or you could say, I never want to see it again, which is good in the beginning. If you just say like, oh, here, great. The articles I collected last month. Let me quickly go through them. And then I think a lot of articles would be maybe, I don't want to see them again. But some of them I would say, oh, that's a highlight. Yes, more. And some of them is like, yeah, that's good. That's okay. That's the third button, basically, to say like, yeah, show it to me again. And then it would be on this spaced repetition schedule. But again, it's not yet live. It's not something we are actively working on at the moment, because we really want to get the fundamentals in order.
Yes.
And so but it's tailor-made, I think, for systems like Trickle, like note-taking
Mm,
systems. The more itemized your options, your items are, the better. You do it with highlights, right? Which
yes.
one highlight per?
Yeah, and it is worth saying that if people use Readwise, it's not super obvious because if you just click next, then it will come back eventually. But there is, I think it's called feedback, and you
Mm,
put this thing in it, then you can say, I want this to come back. Um, I think soon, later,
yeah,
never, eventually, or never,
yeah,
basically. So yeah,
and yeah. So I think that's a good, for anyone who's interested, maybe a good trigger to get into it. And I think when you look at it from this value that you program your working memory, put things in there that you can hardly look up, or maybe where it's awkward. Again, names are such a good example. If you have a
mm,
huge network and you're struggling with names, how, like I am, then it might be interesting, because I find myself sometimes to say like, "Hey, you
yeah,
here, well,
you recognize my
good," and then
face
I'm like craving, like, or like waiting for the name to be dropped somehow, and if not, then
into your mind. Yeah.
yeah. And so that would be beneficial to have more names available, because it's so much nicer to be greeted by
Well,
name.
I think the same tip applies, which is you just have to guess. You're like, I'm
Yes,
pretty sure it's this, but you don't have to say it out loud because then,
yes.
then you, I mean, but if you do say it out loud, you're probably going to really put your brain into learning mode, right?
Yeah, and if you fail, you will never forget that
If
name
they're like,
again.
that's not my name, you're going to remember their name after that, right?
Yes, that's really, "Hey, Robert,
Yeah.
I'm Tom."
And,
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah,
And
you're
then
not going to.
next, you got it.
Mm, mm, mm. Anything you're working on that you want to mention at the end of this, or?
Oh no, I think I'm good. Whoever is watching until now, I want to say a personal thank you,
Yes.
and well, let's say I appreciate the interest in this deep. But I can also say that it's really something where we, I think, both arrived at many iterations and many, basically reading a lot about it. So it might be a good start to get this perspective, and then do something with it in your own life.
That's great. Thanks, Hakeem. And we're streaming on here occasionally, not currently on a schedule, right? But
Right.
uh, open to that kind of idea
Yeah.
if we want to do some more soon.
Me too. And well, I think the good thing is we're leaving a trace, right? Like these
Yeah.
sessions are recorded, and but yeah, I mean, also if somebody has feedback here, that's highly welcome. And let's figure something out. Maybe we do it on a bi-weekly schedule, on a weekly
Yes.
schedule. I'm open to that too.
I would love that. Yeah. And we do thank you. I would also like to personally thank you for watching or listening or however you heard this clip. And yeah, look forward to doing it again sometime soon.
Yeah, likewise.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.